Can you hear me now? Okay, so I got 2 minutes left. Okay, so March 7, 1965, state troopers and the sheriff's posse in Selma, Alabama attacked 525 civil rights protesters taking part in a protest between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. As protesters crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, they were ordered by the police to disperse. When they stood in place, the troopers charged them, attacking the protesters with their fists, nightsticks, and tear gas. More than 50 demonstrators were injured and some were killed. The day of violence, which became known as Bloody Sunday, was covered in newspapers across the country and broadcast on national news, outraging many Americans and garnering international support for the cause of civil rights. Bloody Sunday had a considerable effect on the civil rights movement. On March 15th, 8 days after watching the violence, President Lyndon B. Johnson presented a bill to Congress that would become the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory voting laws that had kept black people from voting. I'm asking the judges in the audience to be intellectually honest. There may be many peaceful protests in the United States, but can anyone say that the protests that remained peaceful garnered the amount of media coverage and outrage or sympathy as a protest that turned violent? Protests are not violent by nature, but at times have turned violent. Here are my definitions. Protest is defined by Merriam-Webster as a solemn declaration of opinion and usually of dissent. Riot, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is a violent public disorder, public violence, tumult, or disorder. It is important that there is a distinction drawn between protests and riots. A protest is defined as solemn, which has synonyms like sober, earnest, and serious. A riot, by definition, is meant to be violent and thrives off public disorder. There is no definition for violent protest because there is no such thing as a violent protest. There are protests that turn violent. The violence that happens at protests can be a result of the actions of either side, either the side of the protesters or the side of the police, or sometimes even a third party. Also, this is not a debate stating that there are no negative results of protests that turn violent, but just that they net more positive results than peaceful protests. How I intend to show this net positive is by showing some of the greatest strides that we have made in this country have been because of the public support garnered by protests that have turned violent. Woo! I didn't know I was going to get that all out with it. Woo! Okay, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead. With 24 seconds left. Man, I ran through that fast. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic.
Okay, awesome. You may have to clarify some of those points because you ran through those super fast, which is fine. All right. Thanks for being here. Thank you for doing this late. Okay, so first I need to address your definitions. You're saying that positive means public support. So positive results, meaning public support, meaning that we eventually get to these rights. You use Selma as an example, yet you say that it's a peaceful protest that is meant to go violent. So therefore, maybe you need to clarify. So I'm going to pass the mic to clarify.
So I'm sorry, and I did run through everything kind of fast because I missed like the first 30 seconds. So to try to get it out now, okay. So what I was saying is that there are peaceful protests, and sometimes those protests turn violent, and there is no such thing as a violent protest or anything like that, because when protests or the paperwork are filled out and the protest is held, it's held in a peaceful manner. But sometimes it turns violent. Sometimes during a protest, violence happens, and that happens. And I'm saying that when there's those peaceful protests, and sometimes they turn violent, sometimes they're being attacked and stuff like that, which is when I brought up Selma, that Selma was a peaceful protest and it turned violent when they were attacked, that positive outcomes were a result of that. And I hope I understand. Okay.
Okay, so I have to attack your claim where you say there's no such thing as violent protest. I have to disagree. There are protests that do become violent, where they start to be violent. You have Antifa, you have the alt-right. Some of these movements come out to be protests that are violent. We can look at the Civil War, where they take forts and where they attacked, where the violence is there. You have the massacre, Boston Massacre, things like that. Selma, but Selma was a peaceful protest. The violence was occurred by the authority. The authority was creating the violence. So the fact is that Selma was a peaceful protest, which I have to turn your argument to say that because Selma was a peaceful protest and because innocent people were attacked by the establishment, that allowed the people to garner support. Now, if the Selma protesters came out with guns blazing and bats and then attacked the police, I don't think they would have gained that public support, because it would have started in the context of violence. So because it was peaceful from the beginning, therefore you're already proving my claims. To say that there is no such thing as violent protest and only peaceful protest takes away all of my ground to be able to debate this debate. So we have to take in consideration that when things are peaceful and start peaceful, it is part of my ground. Therefore, I will prove that there's more positive results, and the positive results of public support to garner Civil Rights Act and things of that nature. I will go through this debate, and I'm going to pass the mic now to make sure that you have to give you the context of how to define this debate, because I do not want to define this debate as we're fighting about what is violent protest, and there is no such thing as violent protest.
Okay, so I think this is where, and I do not want to get into the definition debate. I hate those, and I think the only side where you and I disagree at is that, like I said, when you look up protest and the very definition of protest, it is not violent at all, and that's why I decided to separate protest and define protest separate from riot. Now, okay, violent protest. Now, if you want to say that's, like I said, that's where we're going to disagree at, because okay, the way I define violent protest is a protest that turns violent, and that is whether the people turn violent or whether or not they're attacked by a third party, and which turns violent. By any means, the protest still turns violent. To me, a peaceful protest that remains peaceful at all times would be just some people showing up protesting, and then they go home at the end of the day. And that's how I would define it. A violent protest to me is a protest that starts out peaceful and has peaceful in means and by definition, and then all of a sudden by some manner it turns violent. So I think this is going to be rather oh, man. Okay, all right, so shoot, we are going. So what I intend to show is by mine is that every time there was a protest and every time there's been significant movement and legislation, that it was a protest that started out as peaceful but somehow turned violent. Like, next, my point was going to be, and I only have a minute 30 left, so I'll pass this and try to hit this back when I get it back the next time.
So again, we're going to have to debate this top of case, which is going to be really frustrating and annoying, because violence is the idea that the intention of violence to commit harm, to commit violence, to destroy property, to hurt people, harm them, shoot them, all of those type of contexts, going into the protest knowing that I'm going to break and I'm going to destroy and I'm going to harm all those people who are oppressing me, because there are such thing as violent protests for the context of this debate. And that's why we have to have this debate in this sense, because we're debating the resolution, and the resolution says violent protest. So we have to look at the protest that is meant to be violent to cause the advantages of what that protest is going to get, be it via legislation, be it via, independence, be it all those type of things. Now, a peaceful protest, you said a peaceful protest are things that are going to march on. So I'm going to go ahead and get to my case. So we have to look at the spark, right? The spark is a very important piece, and a lot of protests do that. So let's look at the suffragette movement. The suffragette movement started in a parade in 1913, right? And there were 5,000 courageous women that allowed for them to march through the streets, and that started the discussion that was a political debate within the governmental system of the United States, which ultimately led to the passage of the 19th Amendment. We can say that that march is a bunch of people standing in the street, something different, actually achieved something that was significant through peace without death and destruction. And then you can also look at the Salt March in 1930 when Gandhi marched with dozens of people 240 miles to collect salt from the Arabian Sea after the British said no Indian can collect or sell salt. 17 years later, India gained its independence. And then you can also go back to the Montgomery bus boycott, where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. And 1 year later, in 1956, segregation on public buses were deemed unconstitutional. These peaceful protests had huge market difference in the ability for us to move forward. So that is why the spark argument and why it's important to start with the peaceful protest. And I have to turn your argument from the beginning of this debate saying that Selma is an example of that happening, where a peaceful protest, which started with the march, going across that bridge, and the authorities came down on them, even though they were peaceful, sparking the civil rights movement that allowed us to actually have the civil rights movement that led to the desegregation and the civil rights of people. So that is why, the spark argument is there, and I have to turn your debate on Selma and say that it's actually peaceful.
So the reason why I'm over here and I'm making these faces is because, like, literally, you and I have some of the same points and bring up some of the same protests. So it's funny because you just used my argument for my second term. So, all right, now we're talking about the women's suffrage, and I'll hit on that for a little bit in my 243. Okay, so and this may sound a lot familiar to you. So by 1913, the women's suffrage movement in the U.S. had long been brewing. There had been some movement at the state level to grant women the right to vote due to a number of suffrage parades occurring in the early 1900s. This one, held in Washington, D.C., was planned for the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson for maximum press attention. According to the Library of Congress, thousands took part in the parade, which sought an amendment to the Constitution allowing women to vote. After the march, at least 100 women were hospitalized for injuries inflicted by spectators who threw rocks at the protesting women. As a result of marches like this one and a massive demonstration in New York in 1915, which also resulted in women being hospitalized due to injuries sustained, women were finally granted the right to vote with the ratification of the 19th Amendment 2 years later. Okay, so and I guess this all is going to come down to which definition the judges like. So going back to my other slide, which was my first one, which was the definition. So protest, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is a solemn declaration of opinion and usually of dissent. Riot, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is a violent public disorder, public violence, tumult, or disorder. So anytime that there's a public holding with the intent on being violent, it would show that those are actually riots as opposed to protests. Protests are peaceful in nature. And I guess, like I said, we interpreted the resolution two completely different ways. And because when I see violent protests result in more positive results than peaceful protests, I look at violent protests as a protest that turns violent some kind of way, either through the people protesting or through a third party like the police attacking them, or in the case of the women's right to vote, was spectators throwing rocks. It was a protest that turned violent, as opposed to peaceful protests, which are, to me, peaceful protests are protests that start out peaceful or remain peaceful and are peaceful throughout the entire. And pretty much every time you look at a protest, and going off my definition and going to make my point, every time you see something, when you look at the Selma thing and you look at the women's right to vote and those protests right there, each one of those were times where the protest started out peaceful and then they turned violent. And it just so happens the first time with Selma, it turned violent because of the police. And the second time with the women's right to vote, it turned violent because spectators started throwing rocks. And with that being said, I guess both of us should continue to make our case. And at the end, the judges will just take whatever definition they want. All right, I'll go ahead and pass.
So again, we're gonna have to talk about this definition part again, because if we define this debate via the definition that you are claiming, then there's no grounds for me to say peaceful protest, because we can't ignore the peaceful part of the resolution. So to say that protests are peaceful in nature, therefore they are good, gives me no grounds as the opposition to be able to prove that it is more positive result. So as the judges in the audience watch this debate, they have to make that decision that, are we actually discussing violent protest, or are we just discussing protest? Because I would buy your definition if the definition is protest do more positive results than violence, maybe. But the thing is, it's because protest is in both words. We have on both pieces of the resolution. We have to create a line that defines what is peaceful or not. So you look at suffragette, you look at Rosa Parks, you look at the Salt March, you look at Selma. You'll see that all of these were peaceful protests that became violent, but not because they started off violent. That brings me to my second point in my case, which is death toll. So if we look at the Civil War, for example, the Civil War started with a violent protest. It was a violent protest that led to the death of 620,000 Americans. It's one of the most bloody wars that American casualties have ever existed on. And that was extremely negative, because that violent protest led to the Southern's defeat, which put them decades behind in Southern Reconstruction, which hurt their economy and hurt their society as a whole. And the impacts are still being felt to this day. So what we have to look at, that violent protest alone proves that it doesn't prove more positive results and actually creates more negative results. So we have to not discount the fact that a violent protest like that was extremely, extremely harmful. So when you look at the spark, and we have to go back to the idea that the spark is extremely important, because that peaceful protest led to the the catalysts that actually lead to the positive results that we all agree upon on this debate, which is civil rights, which is, you know, ensuring the independence of India, to and the women's right to vote, just to name a few. You also have the Delano Grape boycott, which was also extremely peaceful, which is the 1960s Cesar Chavez boycott Delano, which was a grape picker, and those protests and a 25-day hunger strike helped create the United Farm Workers Union, which allowed those people to have better ability to work and have conditions that allowed them to work in comfort. So that's another peaceful protest without violence.
Okay, so the iconic struggle between the apartheid regime of South Africa and those who resisted it illustrates the complexity of some cases of civil resistance. The use of civil resistance against apartheid was based on Gandhian ideas, which originated in South Africa in 1906, where Gandhi was a lawyer. Using legal tactics to protest its first 4 decades, the African National Congress became more militant in the early 1950s and beginning using nonviolent direct action. There was no change in apartheid until international media coverage started covering the big increase in the number of protesters and detainees tortured to death by South African security police. What the government-ran police would do is, instead of attacking the protesters in front of the cameras, they would peacefully arrest them, bring them to jail, then torture them to death. One man, tracked by the international news community, was detained by South African police on March 19, 1976, and within 14 hours, he was dead. 17 other opponents of apartheid who took part in public protests died in mysterious circumstances during the following 18 months while being held in detention without trial. The exact number of deaths to protesters is unknown, but as of 1977, at least 50 detainees were known to have died in police custody. The crying out of international community due to the violence captured on camera led to 2/3 of South Africa's white voters approving a negotiated end of the minority regime and the apartheid system. So this goes back to make my point. Okay, so yes, we're going to continue to debate on the exact definition, and I'm going to show that. So with my opponent saying that I'm limiting him by my definition, I believe that to be untrue, because that would say that only if it was possible that every protest that started out peaceful and ended peaceful never happened. But there's thousands of protests that start out peaceful and end peaceful, and there's no kind of violence whatsoever. And like I said, in the definition that he said are my definitions are not actually my definitions. They are Merriam-Webster's definitions. It's not like I changed them. I just said what the definitions were. And as the pro, I went first and I said what the definition were going to be. Okay, with that with that being said, what I've tried to show was with the women's right to vote, and with the Selma, and with the apartheid, that there are peaceful protests that start out peaceful, and when there's nothing that garners public support and get people to that cause and affect change as much as those protests that start out peaceful and then there's some kind of violence. Like I said, and I'm not saying that there are no negatives that go along with violent protests at all. And I'm not saying that. So when he brings up the point that there was some negativity that went along with his point, yeah, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that for all the significant changes that have happened throughout history, most of them are tied to quiet protests that turn violent in some kind of way. And like I said, it's important to separate those from riots, like the Watts riots. Those weren't protests; those were complete riots. Everything after the Rodney King or the O.J.
So we have to go back into the definitions again. Just because the protest word is in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, then why add the adjective, which is violent? Right? It's a modifier to the word in the English language. So if you look at the way that it's like you can add like it's a violent anything, right? And you can see that is a modifier to the word that is actually existent. If it were protest on its own face, then I would have to agree with that definition. But because you are completely ignoring the fact that the modifier is there, it completely dulls the ability for me, because you basically say no peaceful protest either. It's all just protest, and that to me is not the right way to be able to win this debate, right? So you have to not ignore the modifier of the word before protest, which is violent. And also to the point I need to also emphasize that if I can prove that if we can have more positive results for peaceful protests or equal results with peaceful protests, then therefore I win this debate. Now, going to apartheid, it was a peaceful protest, and you said the police came in, and the reason that the media came was because peaceful protesters were getting murdered and getting killed. And that is what made it happen. Now, if the protesters were starting to be violent and killing everything, killing the people, all the apartheid, the police, all that, the media may not have picked it up, and it was like, look at the Civil War. No, the media had to go in and say, look at this problem. This government is oppressing these peaceful people. So therefore, the heartstrings were pulled, and therefore that allowed this for the more positive good of that ultimately led to the end of apartheid. So we cannot forget that the fact that because one side was peaceful, it galvanized the rest of the world to be able to help, which leads back to my spark argument, which is if you have peace in protest, then it will lead to more positive results because it actually makes things galvanized. It actually gives sympathy, the compassion of the people that are part of the movement and the people who are spectators to watch. They want to be able to help the people who are being abused, the people who are being violently oppressed. That is why peaceful protest is has more positive results. And if you look at the negative results of a violent protest, which again is the Civil War, which you haven't addressed yet, the Civil War was a violent protest that caused negative results and huge negative results that do outweigh the positive results of a violent protest, right? So we have to use those points as evidence. And then the fact is, if you have more death as well, you're not having more positive results. So when peaceful protests are oppressed, it leads to more positive results, but they have to start peaceful.
This is like the weirdest debate. I feel like both of us should be debating against somebody else. But okay, so February 1st, 1960, 4 black students sat down at Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and ordered coffee. As Time reported, the white patrons eyed them warily, and the white waitresses ignored their studiously polite request for service. 6 years had passed since the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Separate facilities were inherently unequal, argued Chief Justice Earl Warren, but southern states and even some cities in North clung desperately to their traditions of racial exclusion. Challenging Jim Crow through the legal system was a gradual piecemeal process, and large numbers of Americans were growing impatient. The 4 young men, freshmen at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, remained seated until closing time and returned with 300 more students a few days later, determined to integrate the whites only 5 and dime. Okay, so and with 2 minutes left, so the end state of that protest right there, as it started out, well, I got 150. What? I got a minute. Okay, I see that. Hey, stop throwing me off. Okay, so the end state of that one was the police sick dogs on them, water hoses, beating with batons, horses. Everybody's seen that civil rights footage right there. Now, I feel like my opponent is kind of hamstringing me because the only way that I would be able to win in the debate was if I could show that some people that were starting to riot, that went out to riot, to do something. But as I showed that the definition of protest doesn't have, there's no definition. There is no definition for violent protest, because protest by definition is solemn in nature and serious. It's not violent in nature. It's outside forces, whether it be the people who are protesting that turn violent, or whether it's a third party, or whether it's spectators that turn it violent. And in this one right here, that's why you have to, like I said, it only makes sense to go off my, of course, to me, and as the pro who went first anyway, I'm just throwing that in there one more time. That one more time right here, this was a protest that turned violent. And yes, black people did fight back in this one right there, but of course, fighting against a water hose, you can't really do anything against a fire hydrant hose and German shepherds and everything else. But once again, I'm going to say that for all impactful, all the major legislation that went, the desegregation of schools, apartheid, women's right to vote, the rights of black people to vote, all of them were tied to protest, which turned violent in some way, which to me is how you define a violent protest versus a peaceful protest, like peaceful protests that took place on every college campus that goes just without notice because they didn't garner any kind of public sympathy.
So we have to go back into the idea that the violent protest, you have plenty of grounds here. There are cases in society where things started violent and actually affected change, but that's not my debate. My debate is to prove that peaceful protest is more positive with the results, because of the fact is all of your arguments, unfortunately, all start with peaceful protests, which ultimately lead to more positive results. With the indicator that violent protest, you have to go in with the concept, like I said from the beginning, like Antifa or the KKK or people or the Civil War, right? Those people came in with violent pretenses to cause harm, with the idea of using it as a form of protest. That is how the whole idea works. So for this debate, the voters are going to be very simple. We have to weigh it on the fact that because these protests are starting peaceful, that you have to be able to give the debate to the con here. Because if you look at the suffragette movement, if you look at the Selma movement, you look at every example that the pro has given, they all started with peaceful pretenses, therefore causing the results and all the impacts that the pro is trying to achieve. So therefore, his entire case goes to con. And what we have to look at that. The fact is, the con never refuted the Civil War argument. The Civil War argument was a violent protest that led to the destruction of the South's economy and the society as a whole that we are still dealing with today. So that argument alone shows that there is such thing as violent protest, and violent protest isn't good. And that's why all the debates and examples and everything that we have given throughout this debate goes toward the con, because they all start with peaceful pretense. And we have to not ignore that violent protest leads to more death. So the Civil War led to 620,000 American deaths, and that started with a violent protest. And that is very key to this debate. And if we follow the lines of the debate that the pro is giving, we cannot move forward, because he is taking all the grounds and saying all the arguments that I have been making in this debate, which is the peaceful protest, are just nil. And that, and unfortunately, isn't the way the framers intended this debate to go. The framers of this debate wanted to see violent protest and the definition of what a violent protest is and what the definition of what a peaceful protest is.
Okay, I want to say this, that I completely disagree with my opponent in saying that every protest doesn't start out peaceful. Literally every protest starts out peaceful, whether it's Antifa, whether it's KKK, whether it's anybody. It is. Now, if you look at the KKK protests that turned violent, they all started out peaceful, marching down the street. Everybody remembers that footage from the last one in North Carolina, South Carolina. You remember the protesters marching there. It wasn't until they met up with opposition as what's needed for a protest to turn violent. In every example I've given you, I've shown you that a protest started out peaceful, then some kind of opposition came, whether it be the police, whether it be spectators, then the protest turned violent. It's the same way with the Antifa, the KKK, and everybody else. Every protest starts out peaceful, and just not all of them turn violent, which is what I've shown you. And yes, the Civil War. Now, the Civil War might have started out as a protest, but you can't define a war as a protest. It may have started out as a protest, but it turned into a war as defined by war.
So I'm not going to take up this whole entire time because you only had 30 seconds, but I had, so you proved my case when you say all protests are peaceful. So therefore peaceful protest is more positive. And that's what he said. But the voters are my contentions, which is the spark. All peaceful protest leads to good things. The death toll that the Civil War creates, which is a violent protest, which is a negative thing. And the fact that you have to acknowledge my definitions. I'm going to quit early because of fairness.